Perfect. Okay, guys. So let's talk about a couple things going on in Toronto. So I want to talk a little bit about myself, the projects that we're dealing with, and then maybe some of these types of projects can relate to you guys, or if you guys have any questions about specific projects. Either I have done it, or I know somebody else that has done it and can help you guys. So today's all about you guys. So let's start with the smallest stuff that we're working on right now. Duplexes and garden suites. That's what we're working on right now in Toronto. But the most popular one is probably the garden suite. So let's take a few minutes to talk about that. So with garden suites, the way that the city is working on now, since of course garden suites have always been allowed, but as of this year, May 2023, can't remember the specific dates, but they'll now allow multiplex housing in Toronto. So any residential units or areas that you have in Toronto can have up to maybe 5 units, 4 units within the house, and then the 5th unit as a garden suite. Keep in mind that does not mean that your garden suite can have 2 units inside, of course, the garden suite, because this is what some people are misunderstanding. Okay, Henry, I can do 5 units, so maybe 3 and 2. That's not how it works, at least for now. So how we're structuring that, at least, is making sure that we're designing the garden suites to have either 2 stories, ground floor and second floor, and having the ground floor being like a garage or some sort of storage room, and designing in a way that we're going to have the rough-ins there for future use to make it another unit in the near future. The second story would be the fully developed dwelling units. Or in another scenario, in like Barrie or up north, what they're doing is now like the basement with the main floor. So that's another solution, but again, you have to weigh in budget costs, right? I'd rather spend more money in the main floor and second than the basement and main, just because the concrete's so expensive nowadays. So that's my point of view. Yep.
Yeah, did they do that so I think Woodbridge now can do four units on a single family lot. Brampton, I think, is doing it, and Mississauga.
So Mississauga, yeah, I think they announced last night that they can do 4 units now.
That actually passed, because I know it tried to get blocked.
No, it was blocked. The council
Yeah.
shut it down.
Yeah.
Mayor Crombie overrode it. First time I've seen. So that gives you an idea how important density is. For the mayor
100%.
to override her councillors to allow for that kind of density means density is the hot spot right now.
Yeah, so a lot of things are going to be changing in the next couple of months,
Yeah.
especially since I'm based in Mississauga. Nobody has been doing multiplex there because number one, it wasn't allowed, and now since it's been approved, I get a bunch of calls there, which is tough because I live in a neighborhood where it's all single-family homes. Now we're going to get to multi-units there, so I'm going to have some weird feelings there, that's for sure.
A lot of Mississauga is single family homes, right?
It is.
Yeah.
Especially when you have the area. I have a lot of requests to do multi-units there, and they have the area, they can do it, they weren't allowed to. Unless you go through something called like a rezoning process, which if anyone knows about rezoning, it's basically a year process to get that approved by the city, making sure everything's done by code, everything is like, they like the idea. Majority of times they won't prove it just because that whole area is single family, so why would you be the one special person to do it? So we've been doing that in other locations, like in Niagara Falls, St. Catharines, down south a little bit, and they have rejected some of our applications there just because of that whole fact. This was again 2 years ago, so it's completely different, but that's just a little bit of information there. So basically, so Mississauga is allowing multiplex. Brampton, I believe, is up to 3. I haven't heard 4 yet, which would be fantastic if they can do 4.
Well, they're going to do that housing accelerator fund, so in Vaughan, the Fed said they're going to give Vaughan $59 million to build 1,700 units in the next 3 years, affordable housing. Right. But with that gift of $59 million, they have to change their zoning to allow single family lots to hold 4 houses. So now they're cutting the same deal with Brampton. Mississauga's already changed. But, like you said, Toronto's already changed as well. We haven't seen the impact yet, I think, because rates have been high. People aren't refinancing to get the money to do that yet. But once rates come down and people start to do that, you're going to see a lot of weird kind of, like there's going to be people throwing sheds in the back or, changing their chicken coop into an apartment. It's going to get ugly for a little bit.
It's definitely going to change in the next year or so, because unless you guys are familiar with that, Bill 23 was approved earlier this year. It was approved actually last November and then in effect this year, which allows people to do up to 3 units all over Ontario. That being said, there are some cities that are pushing back on this. Some cities have about a year or two to kind of rejig their zoning bylaws to allow the 3rd unit or 2nd unit if you're in a residential zone. So throughout this whole year, we've had some cities come back to me in terms of allowing us to do 3 units. Some of them are still lacking behind. A lot of the smaller cities are lacking behind. The main cities, let's talk about Toronto in May, 4 to 5 units. Hamilton has allowed 4 units since of August 2022. And then everywhere else is about 3 units, give or take. So that's how the structure is right now. Of course, Mississauga is the newest one, but we're starting to see some more of a trend going upwards. So we're going to allow more units within the GTA, within other cities. I think the one that's really lacking behind right now, in my personal opinion, is like the St. Catharines Niagara region. St. Catharines Niagara Falls have been lacking for a good amount of time, but they have been lacking throughout this whole year. Because personally, I went up to them during the beginning of the year, asked them point blank if they're going to be doing 3 units. They said they'd get back to me in April. That was like 7 months ago. I went there last week, and they're still working on the new bylaws set to be released early next year. Which, imagine if you're an investor, you bought property in Niagara Falls, or you want to increase your income there, you can't legally. So this is the struggles that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis with the city. So for me, I go to city in person because I feel like it's more valuable for me to kind of speak to your supervisors or the guys on the planning staff to see what the plan is for that city to help my investors. That's what I do. And unfortunately, the feedback that I get general is that they're still working on the zoning bylaws. You can look at the zoning bylaws anytime you guys want. It's all on the city website. Type in the city, zoning bylaws, read through that 500-page document. Again, the biggest problem there is just that it's not updated, right? So talking to the city, trying to make sure we're all on the same page there is the best way to go about that, especially when it comes to interpretation. So what I deal with is, you read something, I read something, we assume we're right, and then we talk to the city and we're both wrong, right? So that's the biggest problem we're seeing now, at least in my field. But yeah, so the multiplex is definitely growing in the next couple months for sure. And just as Joe said, next year or so, we're going to start seeing a lot of people refinancing. For instance, myself, I bought a single family in Welland 2021, converting to a triplex, completed about early this year. Refinancing, and the numbers didn't make sense because nobody else was doing triplexes in Welland at that time. Now, fast forward to now, a lot more people are doing triplexes in Welland. And Welland was allowed to do, they were allowing triplexes long before Bill 23. So you can imagine that they were allowed to do it, nobody was doing it, and when we finally start doing it, there's not a lot of comps in the area. So my numbers didn't make sense based on that time period. If I refinance right now, the comps will be a lot better because a lot more people are doing it. So when you guys are looking to buy an investment property, make sure you guys see the comps, see the area, and what other people are doing at that location, right? Just because you can add more units doesn't mean you can get the best refinance if the comps aren't there. That goes with garden suites too. Our biggest issue with some investors is that they're spending like $200,000-$400,000 on like a brand new garden suite or converting a garage to a garden suite, and the problem is their refinance doesn't make sense there. They're making maybe dollar for dollar, which doesn't, you can imagine all that effort, maybe about 6 or 8 months, and they're not getting the money that they're expecting. That's because there's not a lot of listings or not a lot of sales of like garden suites on the market right now. Doesn't make sense. So you have to be very careful on what you're planning to do, and that's where we're educating our investors on, let's do the plans, let's make sure it's legal, but hold off on the construction for the next year or so. Because this is what I'm telling my investors. So they buy a property, they have a garage, they want to convert it, we'll do all the paperwork. That permit that they get issued is valid for about 1 or 2 years. You don't have to do construction right away. Or you can sell the property with the garden suite approval process as more of a selling point. So there's different strategies you can go about this. So don't be afraid to kind of be creative. And this is what I appreciate about the real estate market here. Everyone's very creative in their strategy. As Joe mentioned too, a lot of people are renting out rooms or shared rooms now that I'm seeing on the marketplace. $500 per side, you're sharing with a stranger, but that's what people have to do. They have to be very creative. 5-10 years ago, nobody would have thought about doing that, but now sharing a bedroom with some strangers seems to be normal now to meet rent.
I'm sort of fascinated by this concept of people being able to subdivide even the garage and start renting it out.
Right.
I'm just like, would that be a possibility? And now it's going to become a big thing moving forward into the future because it's getting approved. Is there a possibility of some landlords to create like a shanty town? You know what I mean? They put the bare minimum into creating a unit, the bare minimum investment, and they're just gonna charge whatever, and people will be living in slum-like conditions if they move into like with a bad landlord.
Yeah, that is definitely a possibility. A lot of the investors I'm dealing with, they like to save money. That's the whole idea, right? For sure. But they don't like to cheap out on products too much, especially when you're converting a garage to a brand new unit.
Yeah.
They have to meet minimum building code. In minimum building code, they're forced to do certain items on a checklist that they can't really cheap out on. So it's not going to really become too much of a slum there.
Okay.
Especially if they want to get that refinance process there, they have to make sure that unit is kind of up to date and I wouldn't say luxury, but good enough to last the next 5-10 years.
Okay, so there are minimum standards they do
Yes.
have to meet.
Yes, of course,
Okay.
yeah. So, no, it's a good point, because again, investors want to be sure they're not breaking the bank on their investment there, right? But at the same time, they don't want to, spend too much. Which, again, similar to myself, I just don't want to spend too much, but at the same time, we have to understand people are going to be living in these units for a long time. But yeah, no, it's a good point, because, we understand that from more of a, I think your point of view there is more on the, I guess, existing building and the existing units, that some people kind of cheap out on the cosmetic, or they just don't even do anything and just rent it out as is. So that situation does happen from time to time. But as myself and why I talk to my investors about is making sure we're doing at least a bare minimum cosmetic upgrade. There's different levels to this renovation tier, right? There's the cosmetic upgrade, the trim work, the paint, the doors, and then the flooring. And then the next level is like the kitchen, the in-suite laundry, redoing the entire bathroom, and then there's a whole gut-in system where you just gut everything to the studs and then just build brand new. There's different tiers to that, and depending on your investment goals, that's what some contractors would advise you on, right? So that's where my point of view is there. But any other questions in terms of that, or maybe the garden suites?
I think a big thing you mentioned was comparables, and that's huge. Like, I have a garden suite myself, I built one on my property, and that's the biggest issue I've had with refinancing my own property, is the difference between what a bank will appraise at and what I could sell for market is like $300-400 grand. Because on the appraisal, I just actually got my appraisal back, which normally you can't see, but because I'm a mortgage agent and doing my own mortgage, I can actually see my own appraisal, because typically the lender owns it, and I got a $35,000 bump for 1,000 square foot self-contained unit.
Wow.
That's it. Because there's nothing to compare to. They don't exist. There's not enough of them out there.
You're a
Now-
unicorn in your area.
Yeah, and there's just not enough of that to compare in the area because of the style of property and because of what it is. And it's 1,000 square foot, accessible, all on one floor,
Wow.
2-bedroom unit in floor heat, the whole thing. And we got a $35,000 bump on our appraisal for it because they don't know what to do. I talked to the appraiser ahead of time. He's like, "It's awesome, it's beautiful, I love it. I don't know where I'm gonna find comps." So that's a big, like he said, is looking through that whole process and make sure what you plan to do there's comps, so that you don't build everything, go to refinance and pull that 400 grand in value you just added to your property out, and then realize you can't, because no one's gonna value that 400,000 the way you want it right now. In 2 or 3 years time, once he's built half the city, we're gonna have no issues with that, right? There's gonna be comps everywhere, but we're very much on the cutting edge of that stuff, so the comps just don't exist at the same volume.
So there's no one who understands at this point the metrics behind it. The major banks, it's always there, but
I, like, for me, because I'm in the industry, I can talk to people, and most of the lenders understand it's coming, understand that they're there, and they all have a varied view on it. So most won't let you use the value towards your appraisal. Some will let you use the rents to qualify if you have an active lease in place. Basically, no one will allow you to use market rents. So typically, if you're buying like a duplex and no one's in it, you can use market rents. It's an appraiser of the price, and you can use that to help qualify. They won't allow market rents on it because it's not a thing that's existed long enough. If it was rented, they don't have a history. So if it was rented and you have a lease agreement and you can show deposits, they'll use that income. But you can't use market rents for it like you could a normal rental, because it's so new and they can't guarantee. They're worried about people being like, "Oh yeah, I got a shed in my backyard. It was market rents for $2,500. I want to use it." It's just not new enough. But even if you can use the market rents, you can't necessarily get that appraised value. So my place came back at like 1.15 or something like that, because I got $35K for that unit, which is worth $400 or $500K. So it's a really big thing, especially if you're looking to do the typical investment of buy, renovate, refinance, that whatever those letters are that people
The
always
BRRRR method.
Yeah, there we go. I was gonna say, I know there's an acronym. If you're planning on doing that, being aware of what you can actually get back out after, if you need that money for cash flow.
Sorry, you had a question?
Yeah. So when it comes to an investor, let's say, owns a property, or maybe somebody who's not yet an investor, my sense, before they look at adding a garden suite, before they look at adding a laneway suite, probably the easiest thing for them to do is to transform their basement, if they have one, into a standalone unit that can be rented out.
Yes.
If that's the case, and and let's say this plays out in Toronto, it can play out in Mississauga, Brampton, so many different areas. If it's a end unit townhouse that has no entrance to the basement, or it's some other form of property that does not currently have an entrance to the basement, but you could add a side entrance. And let's say it's just a bare basement, it doesn't have a washroom, it doesn't have a kitchen. What would be your thought process on how you would advise someone to turn their existing basement that is just bare bones into an income property? What would be your thought process that you go through?
So here's my thought process. Number one is, what city is it in?
Toronto.
So it's in Toronto, allows multiplex units. Is there an investment goal to do the triplex, fourplex sort of thing? And if it is, right, there is a different sort of method to this. So back then, when people had, let's say, whatever unit they had, house they had, and they had a basement unit, the typical rule of thumb is, 6 foot high ceilings, the room spaces, natural lighting, the secondary exit spaces, like those are the typical rule of thumbs that we've been adjusted to the last 5-7 years since the secondary suites were in place. As of today, in terms of like the multi-units, like the 3, 4, 5 units, we're playing a different game altogether. We're no longer able to get that 6'5" for the basement, we need to get 6'11". And unfortunately, a lot of the houses that we're looking at, they don't have 6'11" ceiling height. So I was able to talk to a couple of the cities, like Toronto, Hamilton, and not Mississauga, it was, I think, Oshawa. But basically how they've interpreted it is that what we're going to do is we're going to make that duplex conversion. We're going to make the basement unit as one permit. So the basement's going to be one unit, the rest of the building will be the second unit, and that's how we'll do it, just to get your duplex legalized.
Okay.
Then you refinance that process, and then you go in for the fourth unit, the 3 to 4 conversion. And how we're going to split that off is that we're going to make the second floor and attic their own units there.
Yeah.
Now the city, originally they want to look at the basement, and if the basement didn't have the 6'11" height, that wasn't going to work. As of now, after my meetings with some of the city supervisors, is that, it's a legal secondary basement unit from a different permit. We're only going to look at the second and third story. That's it for the 6'11" ceiling height. So you now are able to do so without doing, let's say, underpinning, for example.
Okay.
That was
That's
one of the
huge.
biggest
Oh, yeah,
struggles.
that's
That's a huge-
massive, so it's all in how you do your permitting.
Yeah, so there's a strategy to that, because
Yeah.
like a lot of my investors were looking at underpinning, which, for those of you who don't understand underpinning, it's like basically lowering the basement slab lower. And it's a huge process, tens of thousands of dollars, like $40,000-$60,000, just for a house. Imagine a building that some of our investors are looking to do.
And that's just to still have a basement. Nothing's better, your basement just got deeper.
Yeah, exactly.
It's still ugly and concrete.
But you lose space too, because when you drop the underpinning, you have this whole footing just coming out,
Dimension,
and now you lose more space. So it's not beneficial. So we found a strategy with the city supervisors that we can do that without breaking the bank,
Okay.
right?
Then
So
you
that
have
would
to do
be,
your construction in 2 tiers though, I guess, is that
Yes.
the piece. You gotta get done, close the permit out before you start these.
so they won't approve the fourplex permit unless the duplex permit's already done.
And close.
But that's the whole process. So you do your duplex, you get it done, you get it closed off with the city, and you get your refinance from that.
Yeah,
use
use
the
your
money
market
from that.
rents,
Yeah.
refi.
And then
Okay,
use that refinance money to do your 3-4 unit conversion.
Nice.
It's a little bit of a longer process than doing 1 to 4.
But if you can save 60 grand in benching the foundation, that's.
Well, it's even your construction method too. So
Yeah.
how we're dealing with it is like when some investors buy some properties, maybe the whole building's vacant. So, and this, you didn't hear this from me, but basically it's just you can start some other things in construction in the other 2 units.
Yeah, you get your plumbing and you're like,
Yeah, the
all roughed
frame,
in to be able
the
to.
framing, the rough things, right? As long as you don't close it off, a lot of inspectors are able to kind of give you, not give you a hard time, right? At least you're not dividing your construction team in half, first phase and second phase, even though that's where it really is.
Yeah, cool.
But just to make sure we're not losing on time on that, that's how we kind of address these multi-unit conversion projects in Toronto and Hamilton, right? But yeah, to answer your question, that would be my kind of thought process when people are asking me about their basement situation there. But
That's
even the walkout situation is almost another 20,000-30,000. So if we can do interior stairways, like open up a doorway and just put a wood landing, all the best there. It's a lot more cheaper.
Okay.
So like my mind process, because I used to be a construction manager a few years ago, is understand how the construction works and where we can save some money there. And again, I'm not biased like any particular method there. I'm just trying to be sure you're not losing too much money on the method, and I treat it as my own. Like what I've done, right? I make no money. I don't make any more money charging you guys extra for a basement walkout versus the alternative strategy. So I'm being very transparent in how I deal with my investment projects. But that's the multi-unit conversion projects here in Toronto. We talked about the garden suites, we talked about the 3-4 unit conversions. Let me get into a little bit more specific in the 3-4 unit conversions, because there's a very popular issue that we're dealing with, specifically with attic spaces. So in Hamilton and Toronto, you'll see like these massive attic spaces that you could, in theory, put a unit in there. They have enough space. The issue is the secondary exits. So how we're dealing with it right now is that some of the attic spaces that we could do units in, they do have like a rear side like fire escape or wood deck escape, something that connects the ground floor directly to the attic. If you buy a property that already has that, perfect. You just save yourself like $20,000, $30,000 worth of work. If you don't have it, then you have to build one out. There's no perfect way to do that. There's more like you have to jig around with the design to make sure that every unit has its own dedicated exits. So let's keep this in mind for any agents out here, or anybody looking to do these multi-units. When you're looking for a building, how we technically look at it, the main floor, the main door, entry doorway, would be the main access to the second or third floor units. The rear side doorway of a property will be for the main unit. The side entry door will be for the basement unit. And the attic would have its own rear side wood deck stairway or metal stairway, whichever you want, whichever it has. That's how we kind of divide up the units there. And if your property has all of those factors, perfect. You can do your conversion fairly simple. All you have to worry about is fire separation, which is another issue altogether, but we can't get away from that. But those are the types of items I look at when I'm looking at multiplex conversions.
Speaking of fire separation and maybe even sound separation between the units, because I feel like both of those are worth considering, what do you find it would be the average cost of doing fire and separately sound separation between maybe basement and main level suite, and then first level versus second level suite? Like, are there any major differences between how you would approach it? There's probably more floor space between basement and first floor because it's literally the entire floor, whereas as you're going to the next, there's like the stairwell, so maybe it's different. But do you have any thoughts around like thought process and cost that you roughly see when it comes to covering fire and sound separation between units?
Yeah, so this is where it gets a little bit tricky and we have to be very creative in how we approach it. Number one thing is, by building code, every floor, every unit that's divided with each other, like horizontally, has to be divided by a fire separation of like 45 minutes and a sound insulation by about 50 STC, sound transmission rating type of thing. That's building code. Now, how we what we approach to these projects is that if the ceiling is gutted already, the inspector's going to come at you telling you should make it to building code today. So the sound insulation, resilient channel, the Type X drywall, make it like brand new. If it's existing, they can sometimes get away with not doing anything and maybe just slapping on one layer of Type X fire rated drywall.
Is
Right.
that specific, sorry, because I did a bunch of them in construction, is that when we were putting basement apartments, they let us get away with that.
Yes.
Where as long as it was existing, anything that we added new had to be separated properly, but existing was fine. If you go from just a basement unit to a 3 or 4 unit, does that change that
Yes.
ruling?
Yes. So in the past, you can see on Branson too. They have some drawings on their website as well. In the past, for basement units, if you have finished basement, you can get away with just keeping the existing half-inch drywall. That's it. The problem was there were some inspectors being smart and telling me that there was no finished basement permit in the past. So it was an illegal finished basement, and so they wouldn't take that existing drywall into consideration and wanted us to rip it apart and install the whole new system again. This is what I mean about being very creative. Like, everyone has their interpretation on that, which unless you have the right sort of team there to kind of back you up, there's different sort of arguments being said, right? Now that was like for duplexes. For triplexes and fourplexes, it's considered to be a small building by definition. So 1 to 2 units is a house, you can get away with a lot of things. For 3, 4 units, it's now considered to be a building by the building code. It's not per city, every city sees it as a building. That means more fire separation, more work, more money, more everything. So you really have to run your numbers in construction costs to make sure you're not going over budget. Because right now, some of my team members that are looking to properties that we're looking to buy, we're seeing like half triplexes being done, and they're selling it because they ran out of money for the fire separation or they're at framing stages. Which again, if you're not working with a very real estate investor focused contractor, their numbers are going to be all over the place, right? So just to keep you guys in mind, duplex or basement units are about 20 to 200,000. give or take. That's a huge range, but it just depends on the contractor you're gonna be hiring for that point. Now imagine when you're doing triplex and fourplex. I'll be very transparent. My triplex cost me about $225, and this was like a year and a half ago, right? But again, I have some connections there.
The conversion.
The conversion. And we gutted the whole thing too. We replaced the furnace, we replaced the hot water tank, everything was to the stud. So about $225 a year and a half ago, give or take, right? So imagine your units, today's markets, might be $250, $300, I don't know. It depends on the contractor, it depends on the materials, depends on their timing too. So keep that in mind, like you don't wanna go over budget. Which again, a lot of people can assume whatever the contractor say plus 20% or 30%, that's not really a good safety point there nowadays. So be sure you're working with somebody in the contractor kind of mindset there that are looking out for you and being very transparent with the cost there. But back to your questions. Oh, sorry, fire separation sound. Yeah. So for these multiplex units, for like let's say this is the main floor and then that's the second floor, and this is existing. Well, we can prove that drywall was existing because that building was built to have drywall on the main floor. But the argument was the city inspectors, like now you're having a change of use. This is one unit, that's a separate unit, you need to have the full fire separation. They had been a little bit more fair in the sound insulation, so we don't have to kind of gut everything and put in the sound insulation everywhere. And they just want us to stop 1 or 2 layers of type X drywall, which is easier to do than ripping everything apart and building it back up. So it just depends on your inspector. But on paper, I at least have to tell them we're planning to do the full construction because they won't approve the permit otherwise. So it's been a little bit.
So they won't stamp it unless you say you're gonna do it, and then with the inspector, you can come in and say, hey, it's already there, we're just gonna type X over top.
Yeah, so that's the whole interpretation there, because we can explain to the examiners all day long what we're planning to do,
No,
right?
they don't care, they know how to read a book and say yes or no.
They're very by the book,
Yeah.
right? Which again, I'm like, my profession, tries to argue with them all day long, but I don't wanna waste a month or 2 months for an argument that we can just get resolved today, and then talk to an inspector who's more reasonable on site, because they're the ones who sees on site.
Yeah.
Examiners on the city, they just see what's on paper, right? So, again, no offense to them or anything, it's just different sort of specialty there, right? But yeah, so to answer your question, it just depends on the inspector, depends on the argument, it depends on the city too. So, I did do that, but just because we gutted the whole thing, right? So, but any other questions in terms of fire sound separation? Because that seems to be the most expensive thing. First and then second kitchens. So that's where we're seeing most of the budget go to. Nope, no questions for triplex, fourplexes? All right, so let's get into a little bit more of the zoning thing. I should start with that, but apparently no slides today. Zoning, so when you guys are looking for a property, the number one thing you have to look into, and I'm sure some of you have heard it, the zoning code in that specific area. For instance, this building right here could be zoned, let's say, mixed use, so residential and commercial. But on the other side of the building here or something, it could be just residential. So you have to be very careful in the neighborhood you're looking at, that one side of the street may not be the same thing as the other side. Or even property to property, they're all different. So just don't assume they're going to be the same thing all around. We've had situations specifically in Toronto and Hamilton that 2 properties right beside each other aren't the same zone. And that broke the deal a couple times with some of our investors. So just be sure you look at the zoning, see what you're permitted to use. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me, or you can send an appointment with the city. City of Toronto now does appointments based on the actual you have to send an appointment 1 week in advance, right? Which of course, when you're looking for a deal and trying to close that deal as soon as possible, that 1 week could make or break your deal, right? And again, coming to me is not going to help too much because sometimes I have to confirm with the city as well. Now, other than that, other cities like Hamilton, St. Catharines, Niagara, Welland, they're all walk-in basis. So you can just walk in there, ask your questions, and be done with it 15-minute time. So just be careful with the city you're working with, the zoning you're working with, any potentials that you have there, right? So, okay, so we covered ADUs, duplexes, multiplex, zoning. I want to talk about a little bit about apartments because that's where my company is mainly focusing on right now. And hopefully you guys have some questions there. Because ideas with some of our investors is they are looking to the apartment space because it falls under commercial lending. It's not based on their primary income, and they can use other people's money in a way. So apartment buildings. So what we're working on right now is like anywhere between like the 6 to 30 unit apartment buildings, which you can imagine over 5 units you can get into commercial lending, right? But some of the problems that we're dealing with right now, again, I like to talk about the pain points, is that with CHMC finance, you need at least 5 dwelling units and at least 70% of the building having residential use. So just picture this, in Toronto or even Hamilton most likely, you have a 3-story downtown building where it has commercial on the ground floor, residential on the second and third floor. If you run the numbers, the residential use is only 66%. It does not meet the 70% requirement, so you can't get that financing. However, I was able to talk to some city officials there, and luckily, some of them have interpreted a way where we can build out a storage on the back end of the ground floor unit and call it residential storage lockers in a way. So instead of making a unit, we made a storage room, so we now get that 70% for CHMC financing, right? Now, again, we have to go through the permit processing because on city record, that's still commercial. So we can just convert that back space into residential, get to 70%. We already have the 5 units, and done deal there.
That's creative.
Right, so we have to be very, it worked in Hamilton, Toronto, unfortunately Chatham area does not accept that. So there are some cities that have agreed and some have not, so it just depends on who you're speaking to, right? Now, there are some cities, like what we're doing right now is converting a lot of the commercial into residential units, so a lot of the ground floors is being converted into residential. The problem with that idea is that a lot of the cities do not like that because it is a mixed use area. So either we come up with 2 different strategies. Number one, the front side of the building looking into the street will be commercial, maybe as deep as this area, and then the rest of the back side of the commercial building will be all residential. So 2 residential plus like the main commercial frontage. That would be one idea. Or in another case, depending on how high your commercial space is, because some cities want you to do about 3 feet from the sidewalk higher. Right, so if you do 3 feet plus the minimum requirement 7 feet for ceiling height, that's about 10 feet high, then you can do residential units. They just don't want you to be on the same level as a sidewalk. Or last option, committee of adjustments, minor variance, rezoning process, which, like I mentioned earlier, the presentation, it takes about a year to do all this stuff. Not really worth it for the small scope of work that we're doing, mainly for any of the new developments that we're working on. So that's where I would go about that. Speaking of that, let's talk about a little bit of parking because that is a major issue when you're looking at your conversions. So number one thing is in Hamilton. How it works in Hamilton is that some areas would allow you to keep your existing parking for up to 3 units. So if you have a single family home in Hamilton and you do up to 3 unit conversion, you don't have to add more parking. So if you have 1 parking space, that's it, you're done. You don't have to add more. That's a big game changer because before people would go through minor variance for like 6 months to get that parking ratio, 1 for every unit. Now it's gone easier. They would only enforce you to have 1 more parking space for the 4th units, right? So it's existing plus 1. In Toronto, it's a little bit similar situation there, but they have reduced the parking ratio on the majority of the cities. So just keep that in mind when you're looking out for real estate properties there. And I guess lastly, just to wrap things up, new developments, right? So new developments, I'm working on 2 projects. One in St. Catharines, 12-unit new apartment building build, and one in, what was it? It was off Oshawa a little bit. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. But number one is the 12-plex building that we're working on for the last 2 years. We bought a corner property and then bought the parking lot right beside us and merged the 2 lots. And we are now proposing a brand new 12-unit apartment building there. Now, unfortunately, this was before Bill 23, which would allow us up to 10 units, not to go through site plan approval, but we still want to do 12 units. So we've been at site plan approval for about 1.5 years now, and we're hoping to get approvals by the end of December right now. But imagine, when people talk about new developments, there's a reason why it's up to 5, 6, 7 years because of the city's red tapes there, right? We've been working with an amazing team right now, but you can have the best team on your interior side or inside team, but in the city will take like 3, 4, 5 months to get back to you. Now to mention, when it comes to new developments, you're not just working with one person, you're working with almost the same amount of people in this room. There's so many departments you have to get through, and they all have their own comments about your new developments. So just be careful in that case, especially in my case, working in the St. Catharines area. So that's a little bit tougher. And then lastly, the new development I talked about, we're building a new triplex and a new 7plex just outside Oshawa, I believe. Again, can't remember the name. We bought the land, we severance it, and now we're building a brand new triplex and a brand new 7plex there. And again, we're going to be facing the same issues with the city in terms of site plan, well, not site plan approval, but committee of adjustments for the parking ratio, right? So again, there's so many little things that happens that, you have to account for, especially when it comes to your holding cost there. But that's pretty much it. you guys have any questions or concerns, you can always come back to me here and then we can have a great chat there. But thank you.